Blessings to you, beautiful soul. Your angels are wrapping you in light right now, at this very moment. Before you read even one more word, know this: you were guided here. You didn't stumble across this message by accident. Something higher, something loving, something divine made sure your eyes found these words today. Welcome to the Angel's Message for You channel. Beware of pirated copying channels and stay connected to the original source. Now stop, take a breath, because what I am about to share with you is going to change the way you see everything that's been happening in your life lately. There is a love story unfolding around you that is bigger than anything you've dared to hope for, and most people will close out before they hear the part that will bring tears to their eyes. Please don't be most people. Stay with me until the very end. What's coming will be worth every second. Dear one, in the next few hours, something unexpected is going to happen. And I come now with all the light I have been given to tell you every detail. The person your soul has been quietly thinking about, the one you've been trying not to think about, they are getting ready to do something bold. Something the world might call crazy. But in the eyes of heaven, it is the greatest act of courage a heart can offer. I saw everything, and I need you to know this. It doesn't matter who is watching. It doesn't matter how many eyes try to judge. What is about to happen was never meant to please other people. It was meant to follow a true calling, a love guided by the divine and blessed by heaven itself. Dear one, there is a desire in this person's heart that can no longer be silenced. And that desire has only one name: you. Your soulmate is no longer worried about judgment. That worry was left behind the moment their feelings for you grew stronger than any outside opinion ever could. All of that built-up courage is now turning into action. It is becoming a gesture that many won't understand, but one you will immediately recognize as true love. This person is not acting out of desperation. They are acting out of love. A love that is pure, strong, and intense. A love that never wanted to hide but was held back by the fear of being misunderstood. Now that love refuses to stay trapped inside the expectations of others. Now it wants to be lived fully and freely. What is about to happen is the most honest expression of a feeling that has always existed. That is why I am here, to prepare your heart so you can receive this without fear, without doubt, only with the clarity of someone who knows they were chosen. What may look like madness to the world is actually the courage to love with truth. This love no longer wants to wait for the perfect moment or anyone's approval. What your soulmate wants now is to come closer with heart wide open. Even if the world criticizes, even if people say it doesn't make sense. Because inside this soul, only one thing makes sense. And that one thing is you. I know you might feel like you have waited too long. I know your soul has quietly carried the hope of being fully seen, fully chosen, fully loved. Now that hope is being heard, answered, and honored. Your soulmate spoke to their own heart, and after everything lived on the inside, they realized that the one thing they absolutely could not lose was you. This gesture that the world may call madness, I call freedom. Freedom to live a true feeling with no more hiding. Freedom to follow what the heart was quietly asking for all along. Freedom to admit that there is someone worth any sacrifice. Listen closely, dear one. Your soulmate is going to face everything. They will leave behind what once seemed safe. They will go against what others say is right. They will walk away from what appeared to be certain. All to reach you. All to say, I will not give you up. This is not about proving anything to the world. It is about being loyal to what is felt for you. And that kind of loyalty demands courage. It asks for a gesture that may seem like too much to others, but flows naturally from the heart of someone who truly, deeply loves you. Take a deep breath, protected one. What is about to happen is the result of a certainty that grew inside until it could no longer be held. Your soulmate has decided to do something that many might consider too much. But to someone who truly feels it, it is simply courage. Courage born from the love they carry for you. This person no longer sees obstacles the same way. Every challenge lost its weight the moment faith took over. The faith that you are worth every second, every effort, every risk. What is coming is not random or impulsive. It is the reflection of a deep, quiet, unshakable trust that loving you is worth it. Even if it means facing resistance, even if it means standing alone. Your soulmate wants to take the risk completely. They want to cross every barrier, clear every doubt, and leap fully into this choice because there is a deep belief in what is felt. And when a feeling is this true, the only possible answer is total surrender. There is no more room for half decisions. The heart of your soulmate has already made its choice, with strength, with clarity, with no more questions. There is only the desire to act, to come closer, to embrace what has been kept hidden for too long. And all of it will be done out of love, out of faith, and because of you. Maybe the world will call this madness, but in the eyes of God, it is loyalty to what is real. The courage to follow a path that few are strong enough to walk. Your soulmate no longer wants to live divided between what is felt and what others expect. They will do what the heart is asking for. You became this person's place of peace. The reason they can no longer delay what already beats so strongly inside. This was not a rushed decision. It was built with attention, with care, with truth. And now that truth is ready to become action, and it will all be for you. The love moving in this direction is not based on convenience. It is based on value. Your value, your presence, your energy, your importance. All of it was seen and held in the most sacred part of the one who is now ready to act. This clear choice was made by someone who is tired of hiding what they feel. And even with noise all around, none of it matters anymore. Because what matters to your soulmate is living the purest thing they have ever known, this love. What will happen in the next few hours will be unforgettable. It will bring signs, gestures, and a closeness that leaves no room for doubt. Your soulmate is determined to live this feeling without holding back. And you need to know you are being chosen with full conviction. There is no pretending in the eyes of someone who loves with this kind of intensity. Your soulmate will do whatever it takes to be with you, even if the whole world calls it too much, because deep inside there is a firm, unmoving trust that this is all real. Dear one, you are about to be touched by something that brings total clarity. Your soulmate wants to live by your side, wants to hold this story with both hands, wants to turn everything that once was only a feeling into something real, visible, and shared. Every action will reflect a love that no longer hides, a love that has grown in depth, matured in wisdom, and chosen not to be kept inside any longer. And this love is yours. It is coming to you with the courage of someone who can no longer ignore what truly matters. It may seem risky, but to someone who truly believes, this is simply the natural next step. Your soulmate will show you that when love is real, you don't overthink it. You give yourself to it. You don't wait for permission to act. You go. You live. You declare. The faith this person has in what is felt for you will not be shaken. Not by words. Not by barriers. Not by judgment. They will do what needs to be done because they don't want to miss the chance to live a love that is rare, strong, and pure. And you are the reason all of this is happening. There is something much greater supporting this decision. It's not pride. It's not stubbornness. It's love. And when love joins with faith, courage grows in a way nothing can stop. That's why you are going to be sought. You are going to be called. You are going to be embraced with presence, with intention, with truth. Nothing will be done halfway. This person no longer wants to live emotionally distant from you. They want to live together, side by side, with truth and deep intention. And they will prove it with a gesture that might feel intense at first, but will soon warm your heart in ways you didn't think were possible. Your soulmate is coming with everything they have. No masks, no reservations. Coming because ignoring what they feel is no longer possible. Coming because they discovered that loving you is not a distant idea. It is a need of the soul. Life is preparing this meeting of two honest hearts. You will be touched by something that goes far beyond words. A gesture that will say everything. A movement that will show you that when love is pure, not even the highest obstacles can stop it. This decision is being guided by a light that comes from within. And it was that light that helped your soulmate see. For you, everything is worth it. Worth trying. Worth insisting. Worth living. And now that truth is about to knock on your door. Dear one, what is about to happen is not about pride or appearances. Your soulmate is not trying to prove anything to the world. This action is for you with full, complete focus on the feeling that exists between you. What matters now is showing you, through presence and action, that this love is real and deep. The words of others no longer have power over the heart that loves with faith. What is coming is a decision full of truth, built with conviction, and supported by something unshakable from within. It is the certainty that you are the right choice, the only choice that truly matters. Your soulmate no longer lives under expectations created by others. They live under the truth carried in their own heart, guided by a light that never lies. This person is not planning anything to impress. They are making choices to express love with honesty. They will come closer. They will act. They will show themselves without expecting applause or needing approval. The only recognition that matters is the look in your eyes when you realize how honest this gesture truly is. Nothing will be rehearsed. Everything comes from the desire to be completely real with you. The world may judge. People may point fingers. But your soulmate is not concerned with the noise. They are focused on your value, on the faith they carry, and on the sincere desire to live this love with dignity. Dear one, what is being prepared is simple but powerful. A gesture that only wants to reach your heart. A presence that wants to be lived with lightness and with firmness. No more pretending nothing is felt. No more delaying what is right. Your soulmate will act out of love because they believe you are the answer they have always searched for. Take a quick second before we move forward. Many channels are reposting and copying our content and doing unethical work, but authentic energy cannot be duplicated. For the strongest positive connection and divine guidance, always listen from the original angel's message for you channel with the black logo base. Now, let's continue with the message your angels want you to hear. This person is freeing themselves from opinions that once caused hesitation. What others consider acceptable no longer matters. What matters now is what exists between you both, and how strong it truly is. Something that deserves to be lived with respect, with surrender, and with full presence. Your soulmate is no longer seeking acceptance. They are seeking closeness. They want to be near you. They want to look you in the eyes and show that this decision came not from outside pressure, but from deep within. And the strength to take this step came from faith. Faith in something greater. Faith in the feeling they carry. Faith that God is guiding every step. Dear one, there is a deep beauty in this choice. It is not rushed. It is not shallow. It is the answer to everything already confirmed inside the heart. This person understood that loving you gives life meaning, and they decided to live this love with courage, even knowing that not everyone will understand. What is being done now is like a gift carefully prepared, a gesture born from pure intention, with the strength to leave no room for doubt. Your soulmate is not looking to make dramatic promises. They want to show consistency, presence, and maturity, not to cause a fleeting emotion, but to give you something lasting, a sense of peace that stays. And that is exactly what will happen. You will feel loved in a way that is steady, honest, and completely true. This person has already tried to ignore what they feel. They tried to walk different paths, but none of those paths brought peace. And now, with more clarity than ever, they have chosen what others may call a bold act. They know that loving you is a choice that justifies every challenge and every sacrifice. Dear one, you will be surprised, not in a loud way, but in a way that feels deeply real. You will be touched by something quiet but full of meaning. Your soulmate will show through a sincere gesture that they are here for you, and that they are ready to do what it takes so this love is not left behind. This person has stopped listening to what the world dictates. They decided to follow their heart and their faith, even if it means going against what was expected. They made this choice because you are what truly matters. You are the reason this love survived, grew, and reached this moment with so much strength. What is about to happen proves that love does not need to be explained to those who don't feel it. It only needs to be lived with those who carry the same desire. And your soulmate saw that desire in you. They saw light. They saw a safe place. They saw truth. That is why they are coming. There is no more uncertainty. There is a clear and genuine will to show you that even if the world stands against it, this love is standing firm. This person no longer wants to follow rules made by others. They want to begin a new story with you, a story built on presence and truth. What is coming does not depend on conditions. It depends only on what was already decided in the heart, and that decision has been made. The action is being prepared with care. You will feel it in the eyes, in the embrace, in the voice, and in the silence where two hearts understand each other without needing a single word. This person truly believes that loving you is a blessing. They no longer want to hide what they feel. They would rather be judged than deny their heart. They would rather face anything than lose you out of fear. They would rather show everything through action than keep saying nothing. What the world thinks no longer matters. The only voice that matters now is yours. Your soulmate wants you to see, to feel, to know this choice is for you. Dear one, the bold act this person is about to take goes beyond any ordinary expectation. It will break patterns. It will challenge everything that once seemed convenient, because there is something stronger than any logic. The love that exists for you. This person does not want attention. They will act with certainty because they have realized that you are the light where they wish to rest. What once was doubt is now conviction. And even if it brings discomfort to those who don't understand, your soulmate is no longer hesitating. There is only one desire, to make you feel how deeply, how completely you are loved. What is about to happen is not exaggeration. It is not drama. It is an emotional truth that can no longer be hidden. This person is about to change plans, let go of old paths, and release what once held them back. All because of you. Not to prove anything to others, but to align their life with what makes their heart beat with truth. Dear one, you were not chosen by accident. There was discernment. There was resistance. But now there is full surrender. This love was not born from distraction. it was recognized as purpose. And now every step this person takes is guided by your presence. Your soulmate wants to be with you completely. Nothing hidden, nothing incomplete, nothing shallow. The world might say it is too soon, too much, or too risky. But this person does not care. They are ready to reorganize everything, even their future, just to make sure you are in it. There is a plan already moving forward. And this plan is not based on strategy. It is based on presence. Your soulmate no longer wants to be distant when you need them. They want to be your relief, your foundation, a place of peace for your soul. Even if all of this happens in a way that surprises you, it will not come from impulse. It will come from clarity. Your soulmate knows that something much greater is at stake than pride or fear. What is at stake is the real chance to live a life with meaning by your side. That is why this person is ready to leave behind habits and connections that no longer bring light. They are coming to you not to apologize for lost time, but to start again the right way. The time for waiting no longer makes sense. What once felt uncertain now feels like a calling. Now they understand you are not just a choice. You are their destiny. And this person is ready to go through anything to live this love with you. And before your angels continue this sacred message for you, I want to pause here for just a moment, because so many of you, beautiful, wise, deeply spiritual women, have been writing to me, asking about love, about why the man in your life feels distant, about why, despite everything you've given, you still feel unseen, unappreciated, unchosen. Sweet soul, your angels hear that prayer too. And today they guided me to share something with you. It's called He Worships You. And it is unlike anything I have ever come across. This is not about playing games. This is not about changing who you are. This is about understanding one hidden emotional truth about men. A deep psychological trigger that, when a woman activates it, makes her man see her as absolutely irreplaceable. He becomes devoted, protective, present, like she is the only woman in the world. Women just like you are using this to experience a kind of love they thought they had lost. A love that feels safe, warm, worshipful. You deserve that kind of love. The link is waiting for you in the description below. Just click it, take a look, and let your heart decide. You are never too old to be truly loved. Dear one, this decision will not be filled with empty words. It will be marked by steady eyes, consistent actions, and harmony between what is felt and what is done. This person does not want to impress you. They want to build something real with you. This is not about filling a space. It is a response to something that has been overflowing. This person is not looking for you because of confusion. They are coming because they are certain that you are the missing part, and that changes everything. The time to act has arrived, not because of pressure, but because of growth. Your soulmate has matured to the point of knowing that if they do not live this love now, they may carry a regret that no achievement will ever erase. That is why they will take this bold step. They will choose you above anything that feels falsely safe. This gesture will not come too early or too late. It will arrive in the exact moment when the heart and heaven are fully aligned. And that moment is now. Your soulmate does not need an audience. They do not need guarantees. They only need you, your honest eyes, your openness, your willingness to receive the love that is arriving with all its truth. There will be no masks. There will be surrender. There will be change. There will be courage. All of this to make possible a story that was never meant to be left behind. What used to be fear has now transformed into faith. What used to be confusion is now a clear path. And that path leads directly to you, with all the clarity that only a loving soul can carry. Dear one, your soulmate has reached a decision that can no longer be delayed. On the inside, everything has already been accepted, understood, and embraced with a truth that cannot be explained, only lived. On the outside, this person is about to act with intensity. They will cross barriers no one expected. They will go against fixed opinions, all because of what is felt for you. There is no doubt. There is only the certainty that this love can no longer remain distant. This person no longer feels the need to justify what exists between you to anyone who cannot feel it. All they want is to show you how much it is worth fighting for what you have together. The action that will be taken does not seek recognition. It seeks connection. It seeks presence. It seeks a new beginning where there is space for truth and real, mutual feeling. You are the center of this decision. Your soulmate's entire life is being reorganized, not out of pressure, but out of choice. A choice made by someone who is tired of trying to adapt to what no longer makes sense. Now everything is being prepared so that you can feel the strength of this surrender. Nothing shallow, nothing forced, only real, only whole. Dear one, you represent a peace that cannot be found just anywhere. You are a safe harbor in the middle of so many broken certainties. And that is why this person is going to do something no one expected. They are going to break free from everything that was stopping this story from moving forward. It is as if nothing else makes sense without coming closer to you. This action will be taken without fear of judgment. Your soulmate no longer cares what others may say. They care only about what can be built between you. What is coming is a strong decision based on pure feeling, guided by the faith that this choice is the right one. What this person feels for you has already been confirmed with maturity, and now it needs to be lived through action. Every step will be taken with clear intention. There will be no halfway, no hidden doubts. Everything will be shown with honesty. And you will see that this movement carries a power that words alone cannot explain. You will feel it in your heart before you understand it with your mind. Because love, when it is true, speaks through presence, not just promises. Dear one, when the heart finally finds where it belongs in peace, there is no reason to wait any longer. Your soulmate is coming your way because they know you are the answer. What once seemed impossible to change is now being left behind to make space for something new. A new beginning that involves you, that requires your presence, that invites your truth. Your soulmate is willing to let go of old ties, to release what no longer serves, to build something completely new. Not because they are lost, but because they finally know exactly where they want to be. This gesture will be unexpected to others, but deeply necessary to someone who loves. It will not be done out of impulse. It will be done with purpose, with a strong foundation, with faith in the right direction. And that direction leads to you with a clarity that only the soul can see. Dear one, this person no longer wants to share life with empty spaces. They want to fill it with affection, with shared moments, with daily building. They want to make you part of what is yet to come, part of the days, the decisions, the plans that once felt solitary. Now, this person wants nothing more than to include you in everything. The love that is preparing to come to you is steady, light, and certain. Carries no doubts, no unresolved matters. Comes with clarity, with surrender, with awareness. And you will be the center of this movement. Nothing will be done to please others. Everything will be done to get closer to the one who truly matters. This so-called madness that is about to happen is, in truth, the most real gesture your soulmate could ever make. It is the clearest way of saying I love you, not with empty words, but with real action. This person understood that to love is to act, not just to feel. You will be touched by this gesture in a deep way. You will realize that what once felt far away is now possible. Not because of magic, but because of a conscious, courageous choice. This person does not expect perfection. They expect partnership. They just want to live their own story with you, at the right pace, with steady steps, with faith in every chapter. And they are coming with that intention, with that willingness, and with an open heart. You will no longer be left in doubt. This person's presence will speak for itself. Their consistency will confirm everything. Their gaze will embrace you even before words are spoken. And all of it will be done with respect, with care, and with the tenderness of someone who knows your worth. This choice opens paths that only make sense if they are walked with you. This person no longer wants to imagine. They want to build, and they will prove it not with words, but with actions. Dear one, from where I watch, I see everything with clarity. I can see the details you haven't noticed yet. Since the moment that decision was made, your soulmate's routine has changed. There is more lightness in every gesture, a different brightness in the eyes, as if the heart finally found the right path and is breathing freely for the first time. This person walks at a different rhythm now. The body is more relaxed, the thoughts more organized, the actions more confident, as if a heavy load had been set down. Because choosing to love you with courage lifted a weight that was far too heavy to carry. Now everything flows with more truth. Even the smile comes naturally, as a response to the relief that only the right decision can bring. Dear one, the joy you've brought into your soulmate's heart is overflowing. This person has found a new reason to wake up with energy, to face challenges without giving up, to speak about life with real, renewed hope. Days are no longer just about obligations. They now have color, meaning, warmth. Your soulmate has been smiling more easily, showing a quiet kind of courage that the people around them have started to notice, even without knowing the reason. There is no longer emptiness disguised as busyness. There is excitement. There is a real desire to build, to resolve whatever needs resolving, so this love can be fully lived. Your soulmate is handling life's responsibilities with more lightness because inside, the heart is at peace with the choice it made. And that choice is you. Dear one, I see the difference in the thoughts, in the way this person looks at the future, in how they show up in their own life. What once was uncertainty has become movement. What once was doubt has turned into direction. Your soulmate has become more and more connected to what is true. The people around this person have started to sense the change. The calmer eyes, the easier laughter, the lighter presence. All of it comes from understanding that there is no more sense in resisting what is felt. What matters now is living what makes the heart beat stronger. This joy is different. It doesn't depend on compliments or outside approval. It comes from the certainty of doing something aligned with the soul. Your soulmate no longer feels lost or divided. They are whole in a decision that once seemed impossible. Dear one, I see how this decision is bringing healing, not just emotional but spiritual. By choosing to live this love, this person found a kind of strength they never knew before. A strength born from faith, from the conviction that loving with purity is never a mistake. It's like the body is lighter and the soul freer. Simple moments feel more meaningful. And it's all because you were recognized as something too precious to remain at a distance. The courage this person has been showing is visible even to those who don't know the story. There's a calmness in the eyes of someone who stopped running away. There's strength in the presence of someone who chose not to remain silent about what they feel. And I, as the angel watching everything closely, can tell you, this courage was born from love. Dear one, all of this is happening because you are special. because your existence brought peace to a tired soul, because your presence, even in subtle ways, gave life more color. This person smiles differently now, and you are the reason. Your soulmate has been finding ways to get closer, to show up, to prove that there is no longer any fight with what is felt. And the joy that comes from all of this doesn't even need to be spoken out loud. It is written in the way they live every single day. This transformation has no turning back. What is happening is the awakening of a love that was once only a desire, and now has become certainty. That certainty has made each of this person's days softer, more complete, more real. And you will be the first to feel it when everything becomes clear. The next steps will not be small. They will be full of direction, presence, and depth. Everything is being built so that the meeting between you is more than expected. It will be lived as if it were the only possible choice. If you could see what I see from here, you wouldn't doubt for even a second. Your love is growing stronger, firmer, and clearer. That clarity is overflowing in smiles, in glances, in quiet moments that already signal change. All of it is being moved by you. Before this message goes deeper into your heart, pause and check the channel name carefully. Some people are stealing and reposting our content, but copied messages do not carry the same positive spiritual energy. Stay connected to the original source, Angel's Message for You channel with the black logo base. And now, let your angels speak to you. The decision was made with faith and is now being lived with courage. And it is that courage I celebrate every day, watching this soul rise with joy and light in the eyes. Because this love that is coming does not carry weight, carries freedom. Dear one, you have been blessed with something rare, true, and deeply beautiful. The love that is being directed toward you was not born by chance and did not arrive by mistake. It is a gift aligned with the highest plans, given with intention, with purpose, with direction. And this person who is now moving toward you also received that same blessing. You were both touched by something that cannot be explained, only felt. What you carry inside your heart was seen by your soulmate in a unique way. There was recognition, admiration, and an awakening that has never faded. And all of this was allowed because God knows exactly what is being prepared for you. As the angel who has accompanied this journey from the very beginning, I feel deeply honored to guide a feeling that is forming with such truth. There is something in this love that is not found every day. A quiet surrender, a giving without demand, a connection that overcomes the doubts of the world. Dear one, you need to understand that everything is being guided with care. This is not something forced by circumstances. It is a path drawn with faith, with respect, with time. Your soulmate was touched little by little until they understood that you were not just a distant thought. You were real. And now everything moves in the direction of that certainty. The connection between you is a blessing, and you were both chosen to live it fully. This person was touched by a strength that only true love can awaken. A strength that does not hesitate. A strength that turns into courage, into decision, into presence. And that presence will become more and more visible in your life. Because what is coming has already been confirmed in heaven. Dear one, this story has meaning. It is not just about emotion. It is about truth. A truth that changed the way this person sees life. And this feeling continues to grow and become stronger because it is built on a foundation that cannot be shaken. The choice to love with soul. This love did not come to create confusion. Came to complete, to heal, to build something new. Your soulmate's life is being redesigned, not out of pressure, but out of conviction. This person wants more, wants something different, and you are a key part of that transformation. There is a real thirst to live with truth, with presence, with dedication. Dear one, nothing that has been felt until now will be left behind. On the contrary, it will be cherished. It will be respected. What you share does not need explanation. It only needs to be lived with surrender, with lightness, and with real commitment. That is what is being prepared for you. This love is your reward for staying strong even on the days when everything seemed uncertain. It is the return of a faith that was never forgotten. It is the reflection of a soul that kept believing, even without fully understanding why, that true love never disappears. And you were right, because this love is coming with firmness, with presence, with light. God allowed this meeting to happen at the exact right time. And now every step that brings you closer is being blessed. You will see it in the details, in the way your eyes meet, in the words that become deeper, in the silence that comforts without needing a single explanation. In every moment there will be confirmation. Dear one, your soulmate is coming with a pure intention. No masks, no empty promises. Only the desire to show that you are too important to be ignored, that what exists between you deserves to be lived with care and with joy. The longing this person feels was not born from need. It was born from certainty. That certainty is being nurtured with faith, with courage, and with maturity. You will begin to see that everything which once felt distant is now within reach. And this is just the beginning of something much greater. This person has understood that love means serving, caring, and respecting. And they are ready to live that way, not out of duty, but out of choice. Because when love is guided by a blessed certainty, it turns into action. And that action is about to unfold right in front of your eyes. What you gave with truth will be honored. The way you stayed, the way you believed, the way you offered your heart, all of it will be acknowledged. Because this love did not come to pass through, came to remain, came to grow, came to bring peace and unity. I am with you at every step. There is nothing happening that I am not watching over with care. This love is one of the reasons I give thanks to heaven every single day. Because I see how it transforms, how it heals, how it reunites what the world once tried to separate. You were chosen to live something extraordinary. So was this person. And now together you are both being guided into a new chapter. A chapter where love will no longer be just a word. It will be a reality. And that reality is arriving with strength, with light, and with the blessing of God. Dear one, the chance to experience a love like this, with such intensity, truth, and surrender, is rare. It is the kind of blessing that only appears once in a lifetime. And when it arrives, you cannot let it pass. This love is unique. It was written with care, guided with patience, and confirmed by heaven. None of this is ordinary. You were chosen to receive something exceptional, something that deeply touches the soul, that changes the way you see the world. And your soulmate was given this gift too. Now you both stand before the most important choice of all, to live it or to let it slip away. Do not carry doubts in your heart. What is coming is light. It is an answer. It is a blessing. And you are not alone. I am here to guide your every step, to protect you when the world feels confusing, to remind you that God is always by your side. It is not about perfection. It is about connection. Two souls that recognized each other from within and now long to meet in the fullness of this life. When that happens, everything changes. Even ordinary days shine. Even silence makes sense. What once seemed far away becomes real. You will feel this in the details, in the way your soulmate looks at you, in the care behind every word, in the sincerity of every action. You will see that this is not fleeting. It is solid. It is steady. It was meant to last because it was blessed from the very beginning. Nothing is built without effort, but everything is possible through faith. The love coming your way will require maturity, openness, presence, and listening. And you have all of this within you. You have already shown it. You have already felt it inside. Now comes the moment to live it with all your strength. This person will show you that it was worth the wait, worth believing in. They will prove that this love is greater than any challenge. But they will also need you. They will need your presence, your honesty, your care. And that depends on your choice to live this story with all your heart. Dear one, this is the time to move forward with faith. Do not look back. Do not compare it to what has passed. Look ahead to what is being born, to what is being offered with purity, and hold on to it with everything you have. Because not every day does heaven allow two souls to meet on the right path at the right time. You are standing before a miracle. It is not time to hide. It is time to reveal yourself. Show what you feel. Allow yourself to be open and honest. Let your heart lead. Love with gentleness, with intention, with peace. Your soulmate does not want performance. They want truth. They want to share life. They want to be a constant presence, not a distant memory. The future you could build together will depend on what you choose now, on the decisions made with courage, on the willingness to love even when the world pushes against it. Because when two hearts unite under God's blessing, no force can tear them apart. Dear one, none of this is happening by accident. Everything has been handled with love. You will understand that every moment of waiting, every prayer, every quiet act of faith was worth it. This person no longer wants to live in waiting. They want to live beside you. They want to be a presence, not a plan, a reality, not a memory. And you can be that safe space, that steady embrace, that gaze that confirms everything. You only need to allow yourself to love with courage and maturity. This is the moment. This is the sign. This is the love that many seek and so few ever find. Hold on to it with all your strength. Make it matter. Honor this feeling. And live with all your soul what was beautifully, intentionally prepared for you. My dear one, I whisper these words with everything I am, hoping they bring comfort and real hope to your heart. You are loved. You are protected. And amazing things are being prepared for you right now. Keep your faith. Keep walking. And know that I am always here, every step of the way. God is preparing a wonderful future for you, where love will be the guiding light, bringing joy to every moment. In every prayer, in every quiet second, I am taking care of you, guiding your path and strengthening your heart. May all divine forces be with you, protecting you, lighting your way, and leading you to live everything you have ever dreamed of, and far more. I am your faithful guardian, the one who walks with you through every decision, every step, every breath. May heaven's blessing always be upon you, bringing peace, courage, and clarity to face any challenge. Know that you are never alone. May peace and divine blessings be with you today and always. Amen.